Welcome, everyone, on behalf of Cambridge Health Tech Institute and our Global Web Symposia series, and our sponsor for today's event, Precision for Medicine. I'd like to welcome you to the Economics of Precision Medicine, how personalizing treatment can bend the cost curve by improving the value delivered by healthcare innovations. My name is Elizabeth Lamb, and I'll be your host and the moderator for today's event. With that, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's event. First is Dr. David Parker. He's the Vice President of Market Access Strategy for Precision for Medicine. He comes to us with over 25 years' experience in healthcare and 16 years of strategy consulting experience that has encompassed reimbursement, health economics, clinical science, and marketing strategy. He is a recognized thought leader in access and reimbursement for personalized medicine, and his PhD is in cell and developmental biology. He received it from MIT. Our second presenter today is Vicki Seifert-Margolis. She is the Chief Scientific and Strategy Officer for Precision for Medicine. Formerly, she served as a Senior Advisor for Science, Innovation, and Policy within the Office of the U.S. Commissioner of the FDA. And she's developed initiatives and programs to drive personalized medicine innovation both within the FDA and in industry. Vicki's PhD is in immunology, and she received it from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And our third speaker is Harry Glorikian. He is the Managing Director of Strategy, former founder of Scientia Advisors, and considered an industry thought leader specializing in strategy, operations, pricing, and reimbursement for companies in healthcare, life sciences, pharma, biotechnology, and healthcare IT. He utilizes understanding of customer and industry player perspectives to shape a sophisticated framework and proprietary analytical tools. That takes care of our introductions, and with that, I will pass the presenter ball over to our first presenter, David Parker.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And to our audience, welcome to Precision for Medicine's webinar today, addressing the economics of precision medicine and how personalizing treatment has a hope of bending the cost curve by improving the value delivered by healthcare innovations. And our thesis behind the webinar today is very simple. It is that precision medicine is a powerful tool with the power to both bend the cost curve in a meaningful way and at the same time to enable drug developers in particular to maintain the investment returns that they need to continue biopharma innovation. So in our presentation, we're going to elaborate on the factors that we see generating pressure on healthcare costs and pharma returns on investment, and we're going to discuss how the application of precision medicine in both the development and the use of drugs can alleviate that pressure. So with that sort of general introduction, I do want to note our comments are intended to address what we see as broad trends and general impacts. Of course, we're very aware that counterexamples can always be found. For example, the year with a greater than average number of drug approvals, or the enriched trial that fails, or the targeted therapy that is not cost effective. Nevertheless, we're asking you to consider precision medicine as a new approach overall to drug development and commercialization and clinical use that offers significant advantages to its practitioners in the future healthcare ecosystem. At the end of the presentation, we're going to reserve time for questions from our audience. What I would like to do now is tell you just a little bit about who we are. Precision for Medicine it's a new company. We were originally founded in 2012. We really began commercial operations early this year. And our goal is to assemble and deliver an end-to-end spectrum of drug development, diagnostic development, and commercialization services that are particularly aimed at the unique needs of the targeted or precision medicine developer. And in this graphic you can see we've got three focus areas. We've got science and strategy, We have a focus in bioservices and also a focus on patients. And indeed, we believe we have a particularly patient-centric approach to the development and commercialization of these kinds of treatments. So who we are, we have at present 130 employees. We have leaders from academia, government, and industry assembled. We have experience spanning all major therapeutic areas and all types of biomedical innovations, drugs, devices, and diagnostics. And as I said, we have what we think is a uniquely patient-centric approach. Our bioservices capabilities are housed in a 65,000 square foot biorepository. We have over 15 million biospecimens for worldwide clinical trials and advanced bioanalytics and web-based platforms to enhance our specimen-based trial capabilities. We have gathered $150 million in equity investment committed to our new model of service, and we are investing that to meet our client needs and to really leverage our experience in collaborating to meet the common goals with our clients. I won't go through the full roster of what we do, but it spans an entire spectrum, as I said, of development and commercialization services, all the way from companion diagnostic strategy, biorepository services, all the way through to post-market surveillance. So with that background about precision behind us, let's dive into actually the substance of our webinar right now. So the first topic that we'd like to address is to examine a little bit the cost of healthcare innovation and the essential conflict that it seems to have with the growing control of healthcare costs. So right now, almost everybody in the audience almost certainly has either seen these graphics or something very similar to it. There's a number of different kind of analyses that are out there currently. And one thing that's painfully clear is that the U.S. is outspending almost every other developed country in terms of healthcare expenditures as a percent of GDP. That was true in 2009. It continues to be true today. Our healthcare spending has been growing steadily, as you can see by the steady climb on the curve on the right. There's no question, I think, among most observers that U.S. healthcare costs are at an unsustainable level already. Now, there have been some indications very recently that perhaps the rate of growth has been slowing. Some of you may have seen two recent articles in Health Affairs which really claim that in 2010 and 2011, that actually the rate of growth slowed dramatically, and there was some hope that perhaps the current crop of healthcare reforms was actually beginning to do its job. Some of you may also have seen a very recent editorial in New England Journal from July, actually, in which the author, Dr. Fuchs, actually disputes that somewhat and, in fact, points out that if you look back from 1950 to 1991, there is actually there's no statistical significant correlation between the 2-year spending growth rate and the growth rate in the subsequent 20 years. In fact, although it's not statistically significant, the correlation is actually negative. So I think any hopes that we might have that the problem of out-of-control growth of healthcare expenditures in the U.S. is slowing may be premature. And given that most assessments of U.S. health outcomes measures puts the U.S. somewhere in the middle of the developed country pack, there's no question, I think, on an overall sort of whole cost over whole effectiveness basis that our spend is clearly much less cost-effective, certainly, than it could be. Now, at the same time, there have been numerous studies over the years that have indicated the cost of developing a launch drug continues to rise. And I think people in the pharma industry understand that either explicitly or intuitively, but it's been borne out by a number of fairly well-documented studies. Demasi's work, I think, is extremely well known. It's some of the first work that actually systematically examined the cost of drug development. But that has been updated, and as recently as 2010, there has been another study that indicates it is even higher, approaching $2 billion per drug that comes to the market. It's worth noting that a significant fraction of this cost arises from failures at phase 3, which is, of course, the most expensive phase of development, but also, if you think about it, a phase at which, in theory, a failure should never occur, given the preclinical, the first-in-man, and the phase 2 studies that have preceded it. Clearly, something is fundamentally wrong with the drug development process overall. Moreover, this increased cost of drug development has not been associated with faster development times that might give more time on the market to recoup these costs. In fact, studies of the time to actually bring a drug to market indicate that the time to market, or the time in clinical studies, has actually increased over the past decade as opposed to decreased. So we're having longer development times with an associated and perhaps driving increase in pharma development costs. Now, how have pharma companies been trying to address that? Obviously, those are their businesses. There is a particular return on the investment in pharma development that their investors are expecting. And I think what we can agree is that what drug companies have been forced to do is to raise the cost of drugs upon launch to try and get a continued attractive return on investment given those realities of costs of drug development and time to drug approval. And this graphic illustrates very nicely, I think, from a New England Journal article in 2009, that over the past 50 years, the monthly cost of oncology drugs at the time of FDA approval has been steadily increasing, and all the more so over the past 20 years or so, to the point where in 2009, the median monthly cost at launch of a new oncology medicine in the U.S. had risen to well over $5,000 a month. Okay? That's a necessary step that we think pharma companies have had to take to maintain returns on drug development investments in this period of lower productivity. So, is a collision inevitable? We've got forces that all seem to be opposing biopharma innovation. The unsustainable rate of healthcare spending, rising costs of new medicines, rising costs of drug development, and another factor that I'll talk about in a moment, which is cost-effectiveness pressure. And I would contend that unless something changes fairly dramatically, yes, a collision is inevitable, and the victim of that collision is going to be innovation in the biopharma industry. All of these trends exert pressure on innovation. All of them make innovation less attractive for investment. In fact, recently there have been two health affairs articles that have addressed, the two that recently addressed the slowing of U.S. healthcare cost growth rates, and both of those articles found that a reduction in the pace of innovation has been one of the drivers that they believe has been reducing the growth rate. But is that a price any of us are willing to pay, either as participants in the industry or as patients benefiting from these innovations? And I would contend that the answer is no. But we would further contend that the application of precision medicine, both in the development and the use of new medicines, has the ability to positively affect each of these forces, and therefore actually may be unique in its ability to simultaneously enable profitable biopharma innovation and at the same time real reductions in the growth rate of healthcare spending. We like to think of it, I like to call it a have your cake and eat it too strategy. So next, I want to talk about an additional factor which is putting pressure on healthcare innovation and which we believe is imminently coming to the U.S., and that's cost-effectiveness criteria. So in a brief departure into a didactic slide, just want to go through what we mean when we talk about cost-effectiveness. On the left-hand side, the cost-effectiveness plane is a graphical way of illustrating how you can compare a new health intervention to a current treatment. If it is more effective and less costly, the new treatment will always dominate. Obviously, if it's less effective and more costly, the current therapy will dominate. In our current healthcare environment and our current innovation environment, if a current therapy is more effective but also more costly, then it's unclear that a new therapy will actually win. Okay? If the new therapy is more effective but, there was a duplication here. If the current therapy is more effective but less costly, it will always win. If the new therapy is more effective but more costly, it is uncertain whether it's going to win in the marketplace. And the tools by which health economists look at cost effectiveness are typically the quality adjusted life year, and they use that to assess what's known as the ICER, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Cost effectiveness thresholds are already being applied in many developed countries, typically ones with more centralized payment systems. And I think one that everyone is familiar with is the UK. And the entity that actually makes these cost effectiveness evaluations is NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. We've chosen as an example here the story of Zelboraf, which was just approved or recommended as an option in the UK in December of 2012. So for about a half a year, it's been recommended as an acceptable option for the National Health Service. And this is an interesting case where the initial submission failed to meet their cost effectiveness criteria, in part because the clinical results were not yet sufficiently clear to enable NICE to make a judgment about its cost effectiveness. Okay? But additional information and additional analyses were submitted through the second half of 2012, and at the end of 2012, NICE concluded the following, as you can see on the right-hand side. I've quoted from the actual assessment. They considered that Zelboraf represents a highly effective new therapy in an area of unmet need. It's got a novel mechanism of action. Importantly, and I would emphasize, is a targeted therapy, and it's life-extending and meets the criteria for an end-of-life treatment. The committee further concluded that the most plausible incremental cost-effectiveness ratio was in the range of about 44,000 to 52,000 pounds per quality-adjusted life year gained, and that the combined value of those factors means that the drug could be considered a cost-effective use of the National Health Service's resources. Now, it's worth noting that to reach that acceptable cost-effectiveness evaluation, that Roche actually had to agree to a discount scheme. So even with the cost-effectiveness demonstrated in their cost-effectiveness analysis, and also the increased efficacy owing to the targeting and stratification of the patient population, the manufacturer still had to offer a discount to meet these cost-effectiveness standards. Okay? Well, the question I think at this point then becomes, when will this kind of assessment come to U.S. shores? And there's no question at this point that cost-effectiveness and its power is well recognized in the U.S. As early as 2004, the noted health economist Alan Garber was suggesting that cost-effectiveness could be an appropriate criterion for coverage. And in subsequent evaluations and position papers, 2008, 2009, other critical stakeholders, not only health economists, but clinicians, including the American College of Physicians, have suggested that cost-effectiveness is a reasonable and necessary standard to be brought to bear on healthcare technologies in the United States. Well, consider the impact of cost-effectiveness thresholds and cost-effectiveness criteria on drugs that biopharma companies are innovating. At present, there's no explicit standard that these drugs have to meet. And I would argue that even in the era of somewhat reduced output of drug development programs, not all of those drugs would be cost-effective by these standards. So what impact is this going to have on innovation? And when is this likely to take place? I believe in particular, that the groundswell for more formal application of cost effectiveness is building, and it's likely to crest and swing into actual action when cost containment pressures become unbearable. All right. It will prove to be what is perceived as an objective way to determine what should and should not be paid for when finally it becomes clear we can't pay for everything. Well, how can those cost effectiveness thresholds be met? Okay. There's really two methods, two ways to do it. You can either reduce the cost of the therapy, which means reducing the drug pricing until it reaches the cost-effectiveness ratio, and the assumption there is that the effectiveness of the drug, perhaps in a broad population, an unstratified population, would remain the same. Or you can take steps to increase the effectiveness of the drug, and that will enable the manufacturer to maintain an existing price point or to pursue a higher drug price point. And one rational strategy for increasing effectiveness is to attempt to stratify the patient population and target a more defined, more appropriate, and more responsive population where the drug will be more effective. So that's an overview of the kinds of pressures that are being brought on healthcare innovation and drug innovation in general. What I now want to do is I want to turn the floor over to Vicki to talk a little bit more specifically about methods of taking cost out of clinical development and how better patient stratification and trial enrichment strategies might be able to do that. Vicki?
Thank you, David. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the recent developments in the FDA and how I think they're setting the stage for stratified medicine and next-generation clinical trials, tying back to some of the points that David was making. First, I wanted to talk about where we've been over the past few decades with respect to drug development and investments in R&D. And this is a slide that's been shown in a variety of forums and formats, basically illustrating the point that for the past several decades, we've been increasing our investments in R&D somewhere well over $100 billion between public investments in the U.S. of about $34 billion from the NIH primarily, as well as biotech pharma investments in R&D spend. And while we've been doing that, we haven't seen a similar increase in the number of drugs that have been approved, in particular new novel molecular entities. Now, this graph does not show the past few years where we're starting to see better trends with respect to the number of drug approvals. In 2011, 35, 2012, 39, and in 2013 so far about 14, a number of which, owing to David's point, have incorporated into the strategies for approval the utilization of diagnostic tools and patient stratification strategies. One of the case studies that one could refer to is the introduction of c-MET assay in screening for patients who would be more responsive to Tarceva. And this really was based on a body of science showing that people who were high expressors of the c-MET were not good responders to Tarceva, and thus the use of a monoclonal antibody directed against that molecule could increase the effectiveness of Tarceva in those patients that were high expressors. I think it's important to note that this assay identified patients and allowed for a stratification strategy that allowed for meeting of endpoint in a case where if all comers have been taken into account, the trial may not have been positive. Similarly, the poster child, of course, for this kind of approach of using a stratification strategy with a marker is illustrated by Herceptin, where the overall success rates of new drug development was 15%, whereas in the HER2-positive patients it was 23%. When we look at the cost implications, the cost for the clinical trial testing when adjusted for the risk of failure in positive breast cancer patients was about $199 million, which in fact was lower than the cost of about $274 million for taxane-experienced patients. The use of the validated biomarker, such as HER2, reduced the clinical trial risk by as much as 50%, resulting in cost savings that were significant. And of course, this was the first study that had made a systematic comparison between patients with and without a biomarker. This study was reported in Breast Cancer Research Treatment in 2012. I think the Herceptin story, though, is well known and is an example of the success that has been utilized in developing a drug, and then, of course, the realization of that success in the widespread utilization of testing for the HER2 alleles for the application of a targeted therapy. So in that context, the FDA in December of 2012 issued what I think is one of the more important guidances to come out of the agency in a long time, which basically laid the groundwork for enrichment strategies for clinical trials to support the approval of new drugs and biological products. And to put this into context, this was a document which was stipulated to be produced under the PDUFA 4 agreements. That was the last round of user fees, and took the agency many, many years under PDUFA 4, in fact, coming up to the wire on this one to actually get the document out. But I think in large part it reflected a lot of thinking that went into the document and how the agency wanted to lay a roadmap for development of new drugs using an enrichment strategy. So a couple of key points is that clinical trials are not designed to demonstrate the effectiveness of a treatment in a random sample or of the general population necessarily. And we know that because we've been using inclusion and exclusion criteria for years in order to set up our patient populations in ways that will allow for us to measure efficacy. These strategies include selecting a population in which the effect of a drug, if there is one, can be more readily demonstrated. And there's a whole host of ways that all of us have been using over the course of many years to do that. This guidance considered all of those and a whole host of ways in which patients can be chosen to make the detection of a treatment effect more likely. It covers three principal enrichment strategies. One which is called practical enrichment, which is decreasing heterogeneity in patients or the noise. And I think this is something that's been more traditionally applied using inclusion and exclusion criteria and disease definition and disease staging, where we know we're going to get the best effective endpoint, where we're able to meet our endpoint most effectively, Prognostic enrichment, where we can identify high-risk patients. These may be patients who are refractory to other medications or who are in late-stage disease. And this, of course, is a strategy that's also been used historically for many, many years. Predictive enrichment, I think, is where a lot of the action is today, and this is choosing patients that are more likely to respond to a drug treatment than other patients with the condition being treatment. And this can lead to a larger effect size, both absolute and relative, and permit the use of a smaller study population. This can be based on a specific aspect of a patient's physiology or a disease characteristic that is related to the study drug's mechanism, or it could be empiric in that the patient has previously appeared to respond to a drug in the same class. Now, in the predictive enrichment strategy, this is where there's been a lot of activity, obviously, in the use of companion diagnostics, and in particular in cancer, the use of genetic tests in order to screen patients and stratify them for clinical trials. There are a whole host of different elements that are present in the guidance that point to design consideration and cautions, and I think that the document lays out a lot of what the FDA's thinking is in this draft guidance. Obviously, it's still open for comment, but really points to, I think, a loud message from the agency that enrichment strategies are here and that the agency is open to entertaining them in clinical trial design. Additionally, recently, last month, the agency released the guidance for industry on expedited programs for serious conditions. And this is a really important document, again, a lot of which was based on action from patient advocacy groups, particularly with the breakthrough therapy designation. And really it lays out the context for how the agency will define things like unmet medical need and allow for designations that make accelerated approval pathways available to developers. And the context is that targeted therapies allow physicians and researchers to identify patients highly likely to respond to treatment. These new drugs show major clinical activity and significant improvement over currently available treatment. And there's a lot of discussion in the guidance about what is significant improvement. And then, of course, in cases where new drugs show so much promise and in cases where existing treatment options are limited, the traditional multi-phase sequential drug development process may not be appropriate. And this is breakthrough therapy designation, which was introduced legislatively in the latest user fee negotiations and legislation, is, I think, illustrative of a very bold step that the agency took. And this was driven primarily by patient advocates in order to designate early stage indications of efficacy as receiving special attention from the agency and kind of a shepherding through the regulatory process so that we can get these new, highly efficacious therapies in situations where there are no existing or where there's a significant unmet medical need to patients more quickly. And so I will close there and pass the baton back to David, I think.
That's right. Thanks very much, Vicki. What we'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about a case example actually drawn from a very, very interesting paper in the literature about how everyone can win. I know that usually is too optimistic to be true, but it may be the case in this particular circumstance. And I'll draw your attention to, as I said, a really interesting paper. It's by Trusheim et al., Mark Trusheim, and it's in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery all the way back in 2007. And in this paper, Trusheim and his colleagues actually began considering some of the questions that we are talking about today, namely, how can the use of clinical biomarkers improve the drug development process? And they identified three potential broad ways in which that could work. Identifying patient subpopulations, which would have, in theory at least, the effect of reducing the size of the clinical trial and reducing development risk. And as Vicki has pointed out, that development risk has been proven to be reduced in actual experience of drug developers. The second is in providing attractive market economics that, in particular, positively impacting the drug revenues, enabling higher pricing of a drug, increasing product lifespan in the marketplace, and because the link between drug and correct patient and clinical efficacy would all be much tighter, streamlining the sales and market adoption costs. They also postulated that using biomarkers in drug development and targeting patients more effectively would help to create a sustainable franchise, increasing patient compliance, in part because patients would have a better understanding of the tight linkage between their disease and the drug that they would be taking to help with that disease, to leverage regulatory market protections and, in some ways, potentially enhancing the IP position. So this, as I say, it's a fascinating paper, and very notably within it, they actually present a rough and ready model to assess the impact on pharma returns on investment of stratified drug development. And let me draw your attention and go through this analysis a little bit. They looked at a variety of parameters, and I should point out that they make clear that this is a thought experiment and not actually illustrated not intended to illustrate an actual assessment of the current market data or necessarily any particular drug development pathway or program that they had identified. But they looked at parameters including patent life, development time, development cost, sales life, and the impact then on average yearly sales, gross margin, gross profit, and their assessment of ROI was expressed in terms of payback ratio on the investment. And in this analysis, they projected what they believe the case to be today. They projected what they think the case will be if current trends continue into the future. And then they projected two alternative futures, a bright future in which they identified alignment of all the stakeholders around the targeting of therapy, which would be drug developers, clinicians, payers, and patients, and then what they perceive to be more like a base case, the sustained future. If you look at it, they've made their model allows them to consider the sensitivity of the payback ratio to a number of different factors. So in the bright future, they assume that drug development time is cut in half from 10 to 5 years. They assume that drug development cost is cut by a factor of 75%, not just because of the shorter development time, but they say actually even more because they project a lower rate of phase 3 failure. That, in turn, gives an extra 5 years on the typical sales life of the drug, taking it from 10 to 15 years. The sales of that drug, they postulate, might be cut by as much as 60%, from an average yearly sales of $500 million down to $200 million a year. But they project that by targeting, they can maintain a price that continues to allow them to get an 80% gross margin on those sales, which over the longer sales life of that targeted therapy gives you a gross profit which is reduced at $2.4 billion, but still more than doubles the payback ratio of the current scenario. Now, they acknowledge that that may be somewhat over-optimistic, so they also look at a sustained future case, which the development time they would calculate stays about the same. The development cost is less, but not by 75%, only 50%. The sales life is not improved, but the yearly sales might remain somewhat higher. They further project in this more likely future that gross margins would suffer erosion from cost-effectiveness factors and overall cost containment measures. In this model, the lifetime gross profit is further reduced to about $2.15 billion, but the payback ratio still remains approximately as good as in the current drug development environment. Okay? So this is actually, I think, a very interesting preliminary analysis. Obviously, back in 2007, they didn't have nearly as much actual data on what some of these targeted therapies have been able to achieve, both in terms of drug development and in terms of market value. The other factor that their model does not take into account is, in fact, cost effectiveness and the imposition of cost effectiveness thresholds for market acceptance, which we would project would further depress the lifetime gross profit available to any one of these drugs, but may still enable, even under cost effectiveness pressures, an achievement of a comparable payback on the investment in drug development as the industry is able to achieve today. And what we would take away from that is in a future in which cost effectiveness is layered onto these financial factors, the benefits of stratification are likely to be necessary to ensure appropriate returns on investment on drug development that are even as good as the industry enjoys today. So that, I think, is a very interesting thought experiment on how this could all tie together to achieve the goal that we think is possible, really maintaining the attractiveness of drug development as an investment out there in the healthcare industry. So what I would like to do at this point is turn the presentation over to Harry Glorikian to talk somewhat about the strategic considerations involved in actually making that happen. Clearly, there have been some drugs to date that are developed that way. Many drugs are not. I think Harry can shed some light on what do pharma innovators need to do to actually bring these forces to bear. Harry?
David, Vicki, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My job is the easy job. I'm supposed to put a wrapper around everything we just talked about from a business perspective. Some strategic considerations when looking at this market, and I must admit some of my talking points are not necessarily going to answer questions, but maybe pose more questions that you need to consider when looking at this. A lot of these questions are questions that we try to answer when we're working with our clients. But you can see that after reviewing the concepts that we talked about today, that clearly, we need to consider economics, especially in the environment that we're headed towards. But more specifically, when we're talking about targeted therapeutics, you can see examples where this works out well and then may not work out so well. And then when you're looking at other countries, those other countries may have completely different dynamics, such as NHS, et cetera. But we also know from patient advocacy groups and our own experience that targeted therapies absolutely have the potential to revolutionize care for patients. But we need to look at is what's the economics of each one of those things, as well as an effectiveness angle as discussed today. So much of this feasibility can and should be determined as far in advance as possible to ensure optimal strategic direction and is taken from within the therapeutic area franchise and from a larger perspective within the company as a whole. Now, to do this, it's important to look at the entire picture from discovery to development to approval to adoption and then ultimately to patient use. And to get to the end game to deliver a benefit to the patient, several considerations really need to be thought of way early on at the start of the process. So much of this is going to start with choosing opportunities in the appropriate disease areas, prioritizing opportunities based on the understanding of target patient populations, understanding the overall unmet clinical need, who is in the space, what is coming out in the short and the long term. All of these are issues that we try to look at or we believe need to be looked at when you're looking at the space. And you also remember in a companion diagnostic scenario, you might be looking at two different products going to two different places within the setting to actually achieve the goal of optimizing your ROI. Now, all of that said, it's critical to justify upfront if there is an actual case for personalized medicine to be made. And some therapeutic areas may not be suitable for a stratified approach at all, which I'm sure makes some of those therapeutic area franchises very happy. But several questions should be going through people's heads as you're walking through this, sort of almost like a checklist. Are you attempting to address a clinical problem where the underlying disease variability that can't currently be determined through the clinical presentation? And this is why oncology is such a great example for precision medicine. The underlying tumor heterogeneity presents within several cancers, and all of this is advancing as we speak. If I go across the river here from where we are to the hospitals, it seems like every few months the knowledge base is increasing and changing, and therefore we're seeing a different approach from a therapeutic standpoint within each of these areas, whether it's breast, lung, colon, etc. Also something to consider are the workflow and the treatment options currently available now and in the future. We are seeing people make decisions based on clinical decision support systems that are being put into their hospitals and systems, and therefore when you're working on something, you almost need to know exactly what's happening on the ground at that time and where some of these people are headed with their treatment decisions. Another important thing to consider is the biomarker landscape, and to know if there are clinically relevant biomarkers are available and accepted. A lot of these biomarkers are either not hitting the mark to give you the right answer or doesn't give you enough differentiation to gain acceptance within the market. Some biomarkers may take 5, 10, 15 years to get accepted. Some may get accepted incredibly quickly based on the results you're seeing from a therapeutic perspective. So after asking some of these questions, and there are a lot more to consider, but we've only got a limited amount of time here, is we need to look at what are the potential upsides and what are the potential risks. And then looking internally against what your accepted metrics are for your organization. What are the margins and ROI that are needed to justify moving forward at each stage of development? And will this product provide a sustainable business over the long term, or will it just peter out? Once that internal case is justified, then it really does come down to commercialization and basically getting the product on the market. And the problem with that is we need to look at best practices to develop, approve, and commercialize these products. And you notice I'm not saying the product. And the problem with that is right now we're at the infant stages when you consider where we started and how much has been done in the past 10 years. And there's still a long way to go, but the only way to go forward is to look at what's been done correctly and then build upon that. So all of these are issues that, if addressed properly up front, as early as possible in the process, and taking all the considerations that Vicki and David made along the way, very early in the process, you'll set the business up for as successful as it possibly can be. So, David, I'll wrap it up there, and then we can go to Q&A because I think we're just at the 12-minute mark.
Thanks very much, Harry. What I will do while we consider questions from the audience is actually to put up a summary of key takeaways, and just to run very quickly back through the topics we've covered today. We believe that healthcare costs are on a collision course with biopharma innovation, and some significant drastic action needs to be taken. We think that cost-effectiveness standards will put additional pressure on drug pricing and efficacy, and we firmly believe that cost has to be taken out of drug development for the industry to continue to be an attractive investment going forward into the future. And so I think, as Harry has summed up, biopharma companies have to look to precision medicine to maintain attractive returns on their investments in drug innovation. And I think, as a side note, we would also contend that, in general, the U.S. needs to be looking at precision medicine as a real engine of healthcare cost control going forward into the future. And that extends far beyond drug companies. It extends beyond clinicians. It extends into the realm of public policy and clinical practice as well. But the idea of getting more for a dollar invested is the best way that we have to maintain the standard of healthcare that we've come to enjoy in the U.S., to improve the outcomes of that healthcare delivered, while at the same time, in some fashion, bend that cost curve at least to level and hopefully maybe a little bit downward. We have a number of questions that have come in from the audience.
Okay, here's the first one, and as you said, we have quite a few. The current reimbursement system in the U.S. is not set up to appropriately assess cost effectiveness. The siloed reimbursement distorts the calculus of fully understanding the economic impact of new technologies. How do we remedy this issue? Your ideas are valid, but until reimbursement scheme is addressed, we can't move forward appropriately to fully appreciate the impact of new technologies on health economic outcomes.
Well, that's sort of aimed my area of expertise, so I'll take the first swing at that and then invite Vicki and Harry to weigh in. I think my first point is, yes, I tend to agree with that comment to some extent. We do have something of a siloed reimbursement system, but we are seeing that in many cases there are programs being developed to risk shift, programs being developed to bundle risk. I think everybody's familiar with ACOs, for example, in ways that tend to break down the walls between those silos. And that, I think, will more readily enable cost offsets in another area of care to be weighed against cost increases in a first area of care. But I would argue that even within the silos, there are opportunities for improvement in return on the investment by virtue of better targeting or stratification, and drugs is one in particular. The drug itself may provide a cost-effective benefit to the patient almost in the absence of other treatments that might be delivered to the patient. In many cases, and of course we all know that the best examples are in oncology, the drug is the treatment that's available to the patient other than palliative care. And in those cases, we can directly observe the higher clinical effectiveness in real-world use that comes from the investment in actually developing and providing that drug. But that having been said, I do think that there are, in the U.S., changes in the overall healthcare system that are being both driven by healthcare reform and experimented with by providers and payers that tend to break down some of those silos.
Okay, I have two questions that perhaps you can address together as they're related. The first one is, outside of oncology, success stories are limited and the challenges greater. Second question, when should pharma realistically begin to look for biomarkers for stratification?
Vicki, maybe you can take a swing at that.
I can take this. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the action right now with respect to biomarker utilization for patient stratification is primarily in two areas. One in rare and orphan diseases where you have a monogenic trait, so you can easily map the cause of the disease to a single gene and use fairly straightforward technologies like enzyme replacement therapy, for example, to correct the deficiency of the disease. So it's really directly harnessing the power of the genome in the cases where we understand very well that the gene maps to the cause of the disease. Similarly, in oncology, you have a somewhat unique situation where the genetic defect can in fact be equivalent to the drug target, and we are typing tumors, not people in those cases. And so we're able to develop very effective therapies using biomarkers to develop targeted drugs and then, of course, select patients based on the mechanism of action of disease. I think whoever asked the question is absolutely correct. It gets much more complicated when you move into other areas. My personal experience has been primarily in autoimmune disease and solid organ transplant rejection, allergy, and asthma. And in all those cases, we know that there's complexity on top of the genetics that are underlying the disease that include environmental attributes in the immune system. I will say, though, that I think the science is beginning to lead us in directions where there's opportunities to use this. So, for example, there's some recent data out on TNF-alpha responsiveness, and that's a huge issue for anybody who's been working in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, on understanding who are the patients who are responsive and are not, and there's some interesting data now with genome-wide analysis mapping those. So I think we're in a place where the science is starting to lead us to opportunities in other disease areas where the situation is more complex. And I think the opportunities and, again, the roadmap that's been laid out for the agency will allow the scientific discovery to begin to be used in clinical development pathways that are now made more apparent for regulatory approval.
All right. This next question is quite a provocative one. Is Big Pharma actually capable of doing what you suggest, or will they continue to, quote, build buggy whips, close quote, because that's what they've already done? If so, is it inevitable that mid-sized pharma, who are not so entrenched and bogged down, will actually take over top positions?
David, we can try and tackle that one. That's not going to be an easy one. You know, we've had a lot of internal discussions about market share shift based on these sorts of products and the move to market. I think the mid-sized companies may not have all the right capabilities internally on staff that the larger pharma may have. But it's going to be a tough call over, say, the next 10 years. I mean, over the short term, it's easier to see what's going to happen. But over the next 10 years, I do believe there are going to be some shifts based on companies that come out with targeted therapies that fall into the blockbuster category.
Well, we've clearly seen that big pharma they have an interest in this, right? And they've got active programs looking at companion diagnostics and development of stratified medicines. I guess maybe the question is, can those companies get out of their own way and actually execute on that acknowledged interest and need? I mean, I hear what you're saying about the mid-sized companies maybe not having the critical mass or all of the right resources in place simply because they are mid-sized and they have somewhat more limited capabilities. But, you know, I think the real question will be, can the big pharmas actually, can they pivot on a toe like an elephant might?
I think there was a book on that, David. Elephants Can Dance.
I was going to say to our questioner, I would say it's an open question. It doesn't yet have an answer. You know, they certainly, big pharma, the big ones, certainly have the programs. They have the interest. They have the resources. Whether or not sort of, the entrenched interest within them that might have an interest in continuing the old way of drug development are more or less powerful, that's hard to say. I mean, I will point out the Zelboraf example that I presented is from a big pharma company. That's Roche. Xalkori, very recently approved, with the ALK marker from a big company. That's Pfizer. So they can clearly do it. The question I think you rightly ask is, can they change their way of doing it across the board or programmatically, or are these sort of one-off successes? And I would have to say that time will only tell, but it's not for their lack of interest or trying to make these successes.
Well, I see that we're right at the close of the hour. I'd like to say thank you so much to Precision for Medicine, our sponsor, to our three speakers today, David, Harry, and Vicki, and to all of you who took some time out of your day to join us and have a nice conversation about the possibilities of these new technologies and strategies. With that, I will say to you all, good day and safe journeys. Bye-bye.